Welcome to the Real News Network in Baltimore. I'm Kim Brown. On Wednesday night, an estimated 250,000 Romanians swelled the street of Bucharest as the parliament failed to pass a vote of no confidence against the majority party, the Social Democrats. This just the latest in a collection of major political and social events in Romania, all which began in late January after the passage of a decree which decriminalized some forms of government corruption. This triggered a massive protest response which pressured lawmakers to rescind the decree on Sunday, plus calls for the resignation of the recently elected right-wing president, and some also demanding a complete dissolution of the government. And to get more insight as to what these events mean for Romania's future, we're joined today with Florin Poenaru. He is an anthropologist and co-editor of CriticAtac, which is a Romanian left-wing platform. He works on issues of class and post-communism, and he joins us today from Romania. Florin, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So first, let's begin with the catalyst of all of this, the executive order, as it were, issued by the coalition government that would have decriminalized bribery and corruption as long as the sum in question was less than the equivalent of about $47,000 US. So what made these legislators think that this would be accepted by the public?
Well, it's still a mystery, to be honest, and I think everybody asked this question because it's not clear what the intention of the government and the party in power now was to pass the decree in such a manner. I mean, in haste, middle of the night, with no transparency and so on. One of the suspicion is that basically the main beneficiary of this decree would have been the leader of the Social Democrats, Mr. Liviu Dragnea, who is the head of the party and who has a trial pending now, and he would be theoretically one of the beneficiaries of this decree, even though I must say that there are opinions who disagree with this in Romania, because the whole legislation is unclear, that there are voicing saying that this not might actually be the case. But the main suspicion and the main reason people took to the streets was this expectation that the decree would benefit the leader of the party, and that it will decriminalize a lot of mayors or other people from the party who are currently facing trials for this particular offenses. So this was the catalyst, this was the triggering moment, even though it's still surrounded in cloud and it's still surrounded in mystery as to the real reason. So we can only speculate at this stage, and I'm sure a lot of people within the party expressed the same concerns, that it was not clear why they were doing that.
Indeed, and many viewed this move by the coalition government to pass this decriminalization decree as it relates to government corruption. They found it to be quite audacious, if not straight out ballsy, because Romania has a rather impressive reputation when it comes to government corruption. Give us a little bit of background about how corruption has sort of shaped the modern Romanian government post-communism.
Yeah, okay. Obviously, corruption was a big issue and continues to be, to a certain extent, a big issue in Romania and other countries around the region. And of course, it plays a very important part in this case as well, particularly because the current ruling party, the Social Democrats, even though they went through a lot of changes in the past few years, they are still considered to be deeply corrupt. One of their former heads was, and the former prime minister was put in jail for corruption charges. A lot of people in the party are currently investigated for corruption charges. A lot of other people were put in jail as well. So the party has this image of a very corrupt, deeply corrupt party, which fueled the suspicions of the people and actually played into these expectations that people had in relation to this party, that the party will try to reverse and curb the anti-corruption struggle. But at the same time, I have to say that now more and more this aspect of corruption, which is not denied at all, I mean, it's still there. The issue of corruption, and especially the anti-corruption efforts to fight it, became more and more politicized. So whenever we frame things as corruption, or whenever we talk about corruption, we have to be very clear there is also a very political aspect to it, or the whole conversation is underpinned by very political expectations, and it's embedded in the political game. So corruption played a part, and I think it played a part in construing Romania and Bulgaria as well as very corrupt countries. And they had this kind of mechanisms of surveillance within the EU after the accession. So it's a political game. It's a very serious issue. But I think the question now is how we deal with it in terms which are not so politicized. So I think that the question now is we have to recognize the problem, but at the same time to recognize the fact that talking about corruption is in itself a political it's a political aspect. It's a political game. So what we have now it's a mixture of the two. This expectation that the Social Democrats might try to curb corruption, but at the same time the opponents use corruption as a political tool against them.
Well, Florin, expound on that for a minute, because obviously corruption an issue, not just in Romania, but truly across the globe, but speaking specifically about Romania. But there have been concerted efforts to try to crack down on corruption. So talk to us about the role of the National Anti-Corruption Directorate, also known as the DNA. What brought about this agency, and talk about the attempts to curb its powers, because they have been extremely successful arresting and prosecuting literally thousands of business people trying to curry favor with government officials, also senators, parliamentarians, ministers in the Romanian government. So talk to us about the DNA.
Yeah. Well, the DNA was very important when it first appeared, I think more than a decade ago. Of course, its full powers and the successes that you described came a little bit later, when the former president, Traian Băsescu, fought very hard to empower this directorate and other connected institutions. And indeed, the results were spectacular, to the extent to which that, for example, the former prime minister, Adrian Stase, also a former head of the Social Democrats, as I just mentioned, very, very powerful figure at the beginning of the 2000s, he was put not only to trial, but he was in jail for several years. And same thing happened with other big figures, people we thought of as untouchables during the transition years. They were put to trial and they put in jail for corruption cases. And of course, to a certain extent, this was expected, and people demanded that, and it was some sort of expectation of transitional justice, to call it this way. But the problem right now, what is happening, is that these institutions became very, very powerful, and they lack now political control, because you see that's the big paradox and the big discussion about corruption we have, and anti-corruption we have in Romania right now, is basically you have a corrupt political class, and you set up mechanisms to try to curb that corruption. But at the same time, you want to keep a democratic framework in which you have this balance of power between the judiciary, the parliament, which is basically politicians, and the government, which is again politicians. So you want to fight corruption within the political class, but at the same time, you don't want to have a particular branch, which is the judiciary, freed from any sort of public or scrutiny or political control. And what has happened with this directorate, it gathered a lot of power, and it's now outside of the political control, because of course now the politicians are corrupt, and the presupposition is that any sort of attempt from their behalf to intervene or control, it's a form of intervention, or trying to curb corruption and so on. So you have this impossible dilemma: how to balance the struggle against corruption, how to enforce anti-corruption measures and institutions, while at the same time keeping democracy in place, and keeping this balance of power in place, and keeping judges and prosecutors accountable. Because there's another aspect to it. What we also encountered in the past few years, along with the anti-corruption struggle, it was also a series of cases of judges and prosecutors and magistrates who were themselves accused of corruption and wrongdoings and abuses of office and so on. It was just yesterday that one of these top profile judges, who was involved in very, very important cases of corruption, was just thrown out of the judiciary system because of breaking the rules. And many other judges are actually in jail now after judging and passing judgments in corruption cases. So the whole thing, it's like a dilemma. It's very it's very hard to discern, and it's very puzzling to a certain extent, because you basically have these two drives. On one hand, to enforce anti-corruption measures and punish people who are guilty of corruption, but at the same time keep the balance of powers and also keep the magistrates and the judges accountable for what they do.
Certainly a lot to unpack out of this Romanian protest story. We've been speaking with Florin Poenaru. We're going to take a little break and come back with part 2 of our discussion about the tremendous protests that have been occurring in Romania over the past week and a half now over the government's attempt to decriminalize corruption. Stay tuned. You're watching the Real News Network.